talk about the position group that I think is unquestionably the most loaded position on Georgia's offense. Next on the Locked On Bulldogs podcast.
You are Locked On Bulldogs, your daily podcast on the Georgia Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is up, everybody? Welcome back to the Locked On Bulldogs podcast. I am Daniel, excited to talk today about the tight end room at the University of Georgia. Thanks so much for being here. Thanks for making this podcast your first listen of the day. If you're a first listener, we appreciate you. If you're an everydayer, we appreciate you. You're the reason that this podcast goes and is what it is. Clint and I built this podcast for you. And so we are glad that you're here. A reminder that we are here every single day talking about the Georgia Bulldogs, even throughout the quote unquote off season. For the most part, we will be here 5 days a week talking about your favorite team. And so make sure you're subscribed and check us out. If you missed an episode, you can always go back and find it. What we're doing in this little stretch is we're going position group by position group, starting on the offensive side of the ball, and we are assigning letter grades, giving a rating to each position group from A+ to F, as a way of just kind of sifting through how we're feeling now pre-spring practice. But the roster is pretty much set. You know, there could be crazy late transfer situation, but for the most part, we know who we are on this Georgia football team for the 2025 season. And so these are our initial thoughts and feelings. They're subject to change, of course, as spring ball, and we learn things, and of course in fall camp, all of that stuff. But for right now, this is a way to gauge how we're feeling, and then a way to be able to compare the position groups and talk about relative strengths and relative weaknesses on Georgia's roster. So, as I mentioned, we're starting on the offensive side of the ball. We've already talked about the quarterback position. So if you want to know our thoughts on Gunnar Stockton and our thoughts on Ryan Puglisi and our thoughts on the position group as a whole, the quarterback position, you can go back and listen to that. We talked about the wide receivers, probably the most exciting position group on Georgia's offense, for sure. The biggest influx of new talent, for sure, of any position group on Georgia's offense. And let's be honest, the biggest need for an influx of new talent, because it was unquestionably one of the worst groups on last year's team. We talked about the running backs as well. A group that I think has a lot of reasons to be really excited, and a group that I think has a lot of reasons to be really concerned. So you can hear my thoughts on that if you go back and listen to yesterday's episode. But enough about all that. Let's get in to the tight ends. I mentioned in the opening, I think it's unquestionably the most loaded position group that Georgia has, because Georgia, I think, really loses nothing. And I know Ben Yurosek is no longer on the roster, and he was a contributor on last year's team, technically speaking, a quote-unquote contributor, and he's no longer on the roster. I stand by what I said. The position group loses nothing because, A, the top two targets in terms of the tight end room are back, and they are, of course, Oscar Delp and Lawson Luckie, and we will start right there, firstly, with Oscar Delp. Oscar Delp, honestly, I feel like had the most unfair expectations of any Georgia football player last year. And as much as people tried to say and tried to remind themselves and tried to tell themselves, no one's going to be Brock Bowers. There is no new Brock Bowers. There is no replacement for Brock Bowers. You can say that as many times as you want, but it would usually be followed up, and I'm just as guilty as the next guy. It would usually be followed up by something like, but Oscar Delp's really talented. But Oscar Delp's got all of the size and speed and talent to be a really productive player. No one's going to replace Brock Bowers. But Oscar Delp, all that did was create completely unrealistic and ridiculous expectations for a guy that doesn't deserve that at all. Oscar Delp is a very talented football player. Brock Bowers is the single greatest tight end in the history of college football and the current best tight end in the National Football League as a rookie. So to compare the two is utterly and completely ridiculous. Oscar Delp, I feel like, had a very slow start to the season and then came on late in the season. Now, if you look at the numbers, part of that is backed up. He was more productive towards the second half of the season, and it's hard to pinpoint exactly why. It could have been more targets because of, as there were injuries in the wide receiver position and so on and so forth. It could have been that as the wide receiver position became increasingly known to be less productive, as it became obvious to everyone, including Carson Beck and Mike Bobo, that this wide receiver group absolutely sucked last year. It could have been that was the reason why Oscar Delp got more targets. But I think part of the feeling behind Oscar Delp maybe having a slow start and then coming on later in the season was because of the subconscious offseason expectations that we put on him, that he was going to be this prolific pass catcher, that he was going to be this dynamic weapon in the passing game. And that's just not who Oscar Delp is. He is not going to be a volume receiver at the University of Georgia. Oscar Delp is, I think, two things, and both of these things cannot be overstated in terms of how important they are. He is an elite inline blocker and an elite perimeter in space blocker. His impact on the run game and the screen game, his ability to block both on the line of scrimmage and off the line of scrimmage in space cannot be overstated for this Georgia football team. He's a better blocker than Brock Bowers was. He is elite in that capacity. He is also a dynamic red zone threat. And I don't hear enough people complaining about Mike Bobo in this particular way. Now, I know that's crazy to say because no one loves to do anything more than Georgia fans love to complain about Mike Bobo. And certainly I have heard plenty of people complaining about Mike Bobo. I have not heard enough people complaining about Mike Bobo's inability to scheme Oscar Delp in the red zone more effectively, because he is a matchup problem in a condensed field situation like that. Because of his size, because of his physicality, because of his hands, he presents a legitimate matchup problem for opposing offense or for opposing defenses to try to contend with. And when you look at last year, Oscar Delp had 4 touchdowns. Now, that's not terrible. It's not terrible, like, in terms of, like, total numbers of touchdowns. Here's the issue. He had all 4 of those touchdowns were in the last 3 games of the regular season. So when I say slow start and then came on late. I think that's part of what you saw last year. It's like it took the Georgia offense 9 weeks to figure out how that Oscar Delp was probably their best, not probably, was definitely their best red zone passing target. And Georgia couldn't run the ball into the end zone. They couldn't run the ball anywhere last year. And so how in the world did it take you 9 weeks to figure out that Oscar Delp was your guy in the red zone? And then sure enough, 2 touchdowns against Tennessee, 1 touchdown against UMass, 1 touchdown against Georgia Tech. Those were his 4 touchdowns in the last 3 games of the regular season. So I expect more of that. He's 6'5", he's 245. He can catch the ball in a condensed field like that. I think he is a weapon. Now, I think Georgia has wide receivers that could also be red zone threats, but I expect to see more of Oscar Delp in the red zone. I better see more of Oscar Delp in the red zone, and his ability to block on the perimeter and on the end of the line of scrimmage cannot be overstated for this Georgia team. We've got other tight ends to talk about, including the most prolific tight end from last year's team, whose name is not Oscar Delp, and we will talk about him and some others right after these. But first, let's talk about Roy. The future of college sports is here, and it is fully transparent. Before the Roy app, NIL negotiations were often happened under the table, and fans didn't have any clear way of directly supporting the athletes that they love. Now, with Roy, you get to be a part of the change and support Georgia athletes in the most transparent way possible. Roy, the NIL app, allows you to choose a player that you want to support, decide how much you want to contribute, and receive exclusive contents from the athletes you back. The best part is that if your player transfers, you get your money back. So you are only investing in athletes that are investing in Georgia. Roy is the app that gives you, the fans, control. No more uncertainty. Now you can provide transparent, impactful support to help shape the way the team and the future of college sports with your contributions. Download the Roy app now from the App Store and start backing Georgia athletes the way they deserve, with transparency, trust, and real impact. This is the future of college sports. Join it now by downloading the Roy app and supporting your favorite players. All right, so we talked about Oscar Delp, who is, I think, unquestionably the leader of the tight end room, and the tight end 1 on the depth chart. But as I mentioned, not the most prolific tight end, either in terms of receptions or in terms of yardage. That would be Lawson Luckie, who really burst onto the scene last year with 24 catches for 348 yards and 3 touchdowns. Lawson Luckie was really kind of a bright spot on the Georgia offense, and particularly so early in the season, but really continued to play well throughout the season. When you are talking about a dynamic pass catcher in the Georgia tight end room, I believe the conversation starts with Lawson Luckie. And I think some of the unfair expectations that I mentioned earlier from Oscar Delp were expecting him to be something that he isn't. Lawson Luckie is much more in line with a featured pass catcher that plays the tight end position. Now, Lawson Luckie is not Brock Bowers, neither is anybody else, but he did have a very productive season for Georgia last year, and I think is going to be somebody that Georgia leans on in the passing game as well this year. I think his decision to come back to school didn't really even hint at the transfer portal. Oscar Delp comes back to school. I think the continuity in the offense for Gunnar Stockton, having both of them back, is going to be tremendous. And I think Lawson Luckie specifically, as his game continues to evolve and develop, we saw last year that he has the ability to make some truly wow plays from the tight end position, to truly stretch the defense, to hit some of those seam routes that we're so used to seeing from Georgia tight ends, to hit some of those routes down the sideline. When we put the tight end over like in the X position, we line him up on the outside, and you see some of those, kind of fade balls like down the sideline to the tight end. We're used to seeing that kind of stuff with Georgia. That's not really Oscar Delp's game, but it is and can be Lawson Luckie's. And so I expect both of these guys to continue to get a lot of run this year. Georgia's wide receiver room is greatly improved. At least, dear God, we hope that Georgia's wide receiver room is greatly improved. But I still think you're going to see a tight end on the field virtually all of the time for Georgia. And I think there will still be several situations where you'll still see two tight ends on the field for Georgia, which I think is a difference between when we think about Georgia's, this is not a wide receiver show, but when we think about Georgia's need for wide receivers and we think, well, Georgia might only have like 3 or 4 guys that you really like and depend on at wide receiver. Well, there's a lot of snaps where there's only 2 of those guys out on the field, like at all, because you got a running back and you got 2 tight ends on the field, and that only leaves 2 spots for wide receivers. And so you only really need 4, maybe 5 guys that you really like at wide receiver, which I think is why, and I've said this before, the most overrated thing you could say about Georgia's wide receivers is that there's a lot of them, that they're really deep. I don't think Georgia needs their wide receivers to be really deep. I think they would rather have them be very top heavy with some elite talent, which I think Georgia has for the first time in several years. But back to the tight ends, I think Lawson Luckie's good enough that he's going to earn a bunch of playing time again this year. He's not the blocker that Oscar Delp is, which is why I think he'll never really supplant Oscar Delp as like the number 1 option in terms of tight ends. And he really is, I think, most effective when he's able to stretch the field. And so not necessarily in the red zone. I think that's more Oscar Delp time. I think when you're back, though, around the 50-yard line and you got a lot of field to work with and you're able to get a guy like Lawson Luckie, released with a free release down the sideline, matched up on a corner who's probably really undersized in terms of trying to cover him, or a safety who's maybe a step slow in terms of trying to cover him. I think that's where Gunnar Stockton is going to find success. Looking at the tight ends, I think that's where Georgia might find some explosive plays from their tight ends. And I think that's why in 2024, you saw Lawson Luckie have a season where he had 350 yards and averaged 14.5 yards a catch. Like, that's a lot. And his long, by the way, was only 37. So when you average 14.5 and your long is only 37, that means you were consistently targeted for 10 plus yards every time you caught the ball. And that kind of speaks to what I'm getting at with Lawson Luckie. I think that's the way that he's utilized. I think that's the way that he most effectively helps the team. And I think that's what you're going to see from him this year in terms of the Georgia tight ends. I think Oscar Delp, Lawson Luckie make a great tandem at tight end. I think their strengths complement each other well at tight end. And I do not think by any stretch of the imagination that there is any shred of hope that the 2 of them together could equal 1/10 of what Brock Bowers was for the University of Georgia. As a Georgia fan, you've got to put it out of your mind. Georgia gets elite tight ends. We're going to talk about some in the next segment. Oscar Delp is an elite tight end. Lawson Luckie was an elite tight end. And we're going to talk about Jaden Reddell and some of these freshmen who are also elite. Georgia gets elite tight ends. They're going to continue to get elite tight ends because they feature them and they use them. None of them ever are ever going to be anything like Brock Bowers. So as a Georgia fan, I hope you enjoy it. Like, we got to witness it. We got to see it. We got to enjoy it. Now, the best thing that you can do is to completely put Brock Bowers out of your mind, because none of these tight ends, even when you combine all of their strengths together, are going to equal anything like what we saw from Brock Bowers. But I think Oscar Delp and Lawson Luckie can and will be really productive for Georgia at tight end. And I don't think either of them are the most exciting player on the roster at tight end. That's the guy that I'm going to get to right after this. All right. Welcome to the third segment. Loyal third segment listeners, the 199 are here. And you know that the third segment is when things get real. And so let's talk about it. We talked about Georgia's tight end 1 and tight end 2. I don't think there was any doubt that these two guys are the first and second string options for Georgia at tight end. But I think if you're a Georgia fan, the most exciting player on the roster in terms of tight ends is the guy that is slotted to be in that third string spot, and that is redshirt freshman Jaden Reddell. I mentioned in the opening that Georgia does not lose anything when it comes to tight end, and I said that knowing full well that Ben Urosic, who had 15 catches for 185 yards last year, is leaving, is not a part of the roster anymore. And so how can I say Georgia lost literally nothing at tight end when they lost a guy that had 15 catches for 185 yards? It's because Jaden Reddell is the guy that is slotted to replace him. He is an explosive athlete. He is a wide receiver with a tight end's body, a 6'4", 250-pound wide receiver. He'll be able to split out outside. He's a very natural and gifted route runner, and he has been turning heads in Georgia practices for over a year now. The things that we've been hearing about him have been overwhelmingly positive. I thought there was a chance we might see a little bit of him, a little bit more of him on the field last year, but I think that it is undoubtedly his time to emerge. And I think the question for the tight end room will be not if he steals reps from Oscar Delp and Lawson Luckie, but how many reps will he steal from Oscar Delp and Lawson Luckie? You are going to see 3 tight ends play for Georgia this year. That, to me, is not even up for debate. You're going to see 3 tight ends. So the question is, how much are you going to see that third tight end? And I think the answer could be significant. Let's just say, I think that by the end of the year, there's a very real possibility that Jaden Reddell is the second string tight end on this team, that he's getting the second most reps. Now, will he finish the season being the second most productive tight end? Again, I think that's difficult to measure because the way Oscar Delp blocks doesn't show up in any box score. The way that these guys contribute to the team might not be easily measured. But I think in terms of snap count and reps, as we get later in the season, I think you're going to continue to see those numbers go up. For Reddell, it'll be interesting to see his level of physicality. Now being a year into the program, taking the redshirt year, what was he able to pick up working alongside those guys? What's the blocking like? How well is he able to contribute in that aspect of the game? Because I feel really strong about his ability to stretch the field and to be a dynamic pass catcher, again, with a big body. He is Not the greatest tight end to ever play college football, but I do think that he provides some athleticism that, I'll be honest, I think exceeds all the rest of the tight end room in many ways. And so how will that impact, how will that end up contributing to the way that he impacts the team this year? I don't know. Time will tell on that. And then you have the two true freshmen. So you have Elias Williams from Camden County, who is an elite prospect. And you have Ethan Barber from Milton, who is another like incredibly interesting and dynamic prospect. Both of those guys' early reports are that they are very good. I don't know how in the world Georgia has 5 tight ends that are as good as they are, but barring an injury, I don't know that we'll see either of these guys. But I can tell you that the future at the tight end position is exceptionally bright at Georgia. And I can tell you that if somebody's going to find their way onto the field, Elias Williams has something that nobody else has, and that is a 6'7" frame. There's a way that you could see him be utilized in specific packages this year. You're talking about a top 50 recruit, again, an elite 5-star prospect. I think there's a chance that one of those guys could see the field this year. I think Georgia will play 3 tight ends. I think even if there's an injury, Georgia will still play 3 tight ends, which means that if there's an injury, one of these freshmen will be contributing in a significant way. It'll be interesting to see how it all shapes up. Let's get to my grade. If you're still here, I think this is the best position group on the offense. I've got the tight end room at an A, and that is knowing what they are going to be called upon and asked to do. That is not to say that the tight end room will be the best receivers of the football in college football. That's not what this tight end room is going to be asked to do. But I think they are absolutely the most complete and are set up to be even more productive than they were last year. Hopefully, as I mentioned, because they will be utilized according to their strengths, a la throw the freaking football to Oscar Delp in the red zone, Mike Bobo. If that happens, I don't see any way that this tight end room is not one of the more productive ones that we've seen in recent memory. And so I've got them as an A, which so far makes them my highest rated position group on the offense. We still got to talk about the offensive line. That will be the next episode coming up, and we will see you guys then.